You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Oh, hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 216 of the Common Descent Podcast, where we talk about all manners of Earth history and paleontology. And today we're talking about plankton, which is a very fun topic that is a very broad, it seems like one concept, but it covers a very wide aspect of living organisms.
Yeah, plankton is a big... Plankton is often mentioned and rarely discussed in detail. A really, literally fundamental part of Earth ecology.
Absolutely. We'll be diving in, since it's in the ocean, we have to, and talking about what plankton is. What are some of the members of the plankton group?
Yeah, what's in there?
Yes, that soup, who's making it up. We're not going to be able to go into every taxa because there's so many, but we will be going over the different lifestyles that are found among the planktonic organisms and discuss some of the ways we categorize them. We'll talk about how the assemblage has changed throughout Earth's history and how some of them might have evolved, as well as their extreme importance to paleontological studies.
Yeah, big deal, plankton.
Yes, they get used a lot. So we'll get to actually learn about these very important research critters.
Yeah, shout out to all of our marine invertebrate micropaleontologists out there.
Yes, we're saying finally.
200 episodes.
Now, we are discussing this because it's awesome and because it was requested, as all our topics are. This one was requested by Tachyorictes Rex, Tony, Noah, Stuart, and Elizabeth.
Thank you, as always, for your suggestions. Hey, on our website, we've got a topic request form where you can submit stuff you want to hear us talk about.
Yes. Before we get into the discussion and before we get into the news, some quick announcements. First and foremost, as always, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon funds the podcast top to bottom. It's what allows us to do all the cool things that we're able to do. If you sign up on there, not only will you be supporting us, but you'll be getting extra goodies, extra content from us, extra interactions. We do live streams and bonus episode content. And you can get your name shouted out here at the beginning of episodes if you're at certain levels. And this episode, we would like to welcome the new patrons Beckett, Katcetera, Bethany, and Cynthia.
Thank you and welcome. Shout out to all of our patrons for supporting our science educational efforts here. We're really grateful.
Yes, very much so. Also, speaking of extra content with us, we just finished up our Silver Screen Science episodes, and yesterday we did our Silver Screen Science live stream.
Yes, 3 episodes on 3 different Planet of the Apes movies, and if you weren't there for the live stream live, it's archived on YouTube, so you can go rewatch it and enjoy our conversations with our audience.
Absolutely, and if that's not enough of hearing us talk, we both guest starred on a couple of podcast episodes recently at other people's podcasts. I was on the Nerd Trek podcast with Jeff, David, and Phil, where we discussed creatures from the Star Trek franchise and basically did some speculative evolution as to what would make the most sense for how they would have evolved or how they would be living and functioning.
Very
we answered how tribbles work, so if you want to know.
So this is in lieu of a Star Trek spooky series some year. I was also on a podcast. I was on the podcast called House of Pod with Kave MD, where we talked about de-extinction and the science of it and the hype of it and the concerns around especially recent announcements like we talked about last episode with colossals, dire wolves and stuff. And that was also a very fun conversation. A bit more real-world, dire stuff than Star Trek speculative evolution. So we got a mix of all different flavors. We'll put links to both of those in the episode description, and they have both already been added to our website. On the page, more episodes. We have a big old list of all of our guest appearances on other shows.
Absolutely. And I just now remembered to remind, the Nerd Trek podcast is not PG, we use adult language and stuff, doesn't get grossly inappropriate, but just so you're aware.
Yeah, there was also at least one instance of inappropriate language. I don't know if it made it into the final episode, but be aware. Also looking to the future, Croc and Snake Month are coming up in June and July, so stay tuned for more about that. And because the world is difficult and tough these days, we like to shout out things. This episode, I want to shout out an organization we've mentioned before on the podcast, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which offers support and resources for all sorts of people facing injustice and also accepts donations if you're interested in contributing in that way. We'll put a link in the episode description, helping everybody stay safe and secure out there.
Yes, so check that out if you think it would be helpful or if you want to help out. And with our announcements out of the way, we can start our first section, which is the news. Every episode, we like to gather some recent paleontological and earth science and evolutionary news and share it with you all so that we can all stay up to date. What's your news today, David?
I'm going to start with lizards because I know what your news is. I got to get in there early. This is now technically not a lizard, but a very close relative of lizards whose ecology has been reinterpreted and might give us some insights into the ancestral condition of the lizard family tree.
Cool.
This is research published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B by David Ford et al., and we will link in the blog post to a press release on phys.org by James Ashworth. So lizards are a group called squamates, that's lizards and snakes. They fit into a bigger group called lepidosaurs. Lepidosaurs are basically most of the reptiles that aren't archosaurs. They're sort of the big two divisions. Lepidosaurs is lizards and snakes, tuataras, and their various other lizard-like relatives. Early members of this group are known back to the Triassic period, but we don't have a good fossil record of them until quite some time after that. So the early condition of reptiles in this group isn't known very well.
Yeah.
A lot of the early members they're not common, and when we do find them, they tend to just be bits and pieces.
Yes.
One of the exceptions is a reptile called Marmoretta oxoniensis, which is either an early lepidosaur or very near early lepidosaur. It's in that sort of base of the family tree, which is known from the UK, specifically from Oxfordshire. I'm sure the UK people will let me know. And the Isle of Skye. Lots of famous Mesozoic stuff on the Isle of Skye, which is from the Middle Jurassic around 166 million years ago. So it is not only near the base of the Lepidosaur family tree, it's also one of the oldest well-known members of this group. It is small. The skull is just a few centimeters long.
Cute.
And it very lizard-like. Unsurprisingly, that's what most within this group, and indeed reptiles in general, tend to be very lizard-like.
It is a good shape to be.
Marmoretta is surprisingly well known from multiple specimens, at least 2 different localities, including pretty well-preserved remains of the skull and the body. Previous research on Marmoretta has interpreted it as potentially being semi-aquatic, and this has been based on the fact that the fossils are found in coastal marine sediments, alongside other marine organisms.
Okay.
So it's in brackish or salty water, which has led to, it might have been semi-aquatic. However, this study performed a detailed analysis of the postcranial bones, which means everything behind the skull, so limbs and vertebrae and all that. They used micro-CT scanning to give them a look at particularly tiny bones, and I think they mentioned this allowed them to look at bones that are inside of matrix still, like within the sediment that haven't been prepped out. They took measurements of the vertebrae, the limb bones, and they plugged it all into a statistical comparison with modern lizards. We talk about these kinds of principal component analyses and things like that, where basically we go, all right, here are the shapes of all these bones in a bunch of different lizards. Which group do this lizard's measurements most closely line up with? What they found in their examination is that the feet don't seem to be the shape we would expect from an aquatic animal.
Okay.
They're not quite paddle-like we see in swimmers. Instead, the digits are long and curved, as though for grasping or something. The spine, they noted, also is stiffened, more so than we'd expect in an aquatic. Aquatic reptiles are often swimming with undulations of the spine. This animal doesn't quite look like it would be able to do that very well. Then they took the feet measurements and plugged it into compare this with all the other lizards, and found that it clustered most closely with members of the iguanian lineage that are arboreal or scansorial.
Yeah.
Arboreal means tree-dwelling. Scansorial means climbing, though not necessarily all the time in trees.
Yes.
Raccoons are scansorial, for example. This suggests that Marmoretta was not semi-aquatic and not even largely terrestrial, but was probably spending a lot of time in trees.
It is kind of the opposite of being aquatic.
It is, it is the other than flight.
Yes.
You're heading in the opposite direction. So they interpret that. Now, of course, this raises the question of what this climbing reptile is doing in brackish or salty water, and they suggest that their interpretation is that it was likely climbing around in trees near lagoons and such, similar to like mangrove swamps today, where we do have lizards and other reptiles that will hang around up in the tree. I guess other reptiles is probably not very true. Lizards up in the trees where they can potentially fall down into the water.
Yes.
This is very cool because, number one, it's just always cool to know how a particular ancient creature was living. Also, this is, according to the authors, the first solid information about habitat use in early lepidosaurs or near the lepidosaur group.
Yeah.
This might give us an insight into how the ancestors of lizards got their start. It might be that the lizard family tree got started in the trees.
Yes.
And if not, this suggests that they diversified up into the trees very, very early on, even before lepidosaurs proper had evolved.
Yeah.
They also make a fun note that this also gives us more information about the verticality of Jurassic ecosystems. the vertical partitioning of animals back in the Jurassic.
Yes. That's pretty cool.
Which is pretty neat. Yeah, that if you were one of those 1,000 dinosaurs stomping around leaving footprints on the Isle of Skye, there might have been lizard-like things climbing around in the trees above their heads.
Well, and it's always a fun thing to study, to look at the potential lifestyle through this kind of research. Because here, it not only revealed what early members of this group were doing, and potentially even earlier ones were doing, but also changed the apparent story of how we were finding these fossils.
Yeah, it wasn't living in that water. It had fallen in or gotten washed in or whatever.
Like, I'm sure they could swim and that they would use that as like, because we see that with a lot of things, like iguanas will do that, where they can swim. They're not swimmers. But if they need to fall out of the tree to get away from whatever predator's coming at them and fall into the water, they can swim away.
Yeah, it's a great strategy.
Oh, yeah.
We see this in tropical environments where if you're a lizard that can climb and swim, that's great because then when a crocodilian comes along, you climb up into the tree. And then when a bird comes along, you drop down into the water.
Yes. So, like, they probably were swimming around there, but that's not where they were specialized, so that's not why we were finding them there, because that's where they were living. They were living above that.
Yeah.
And it's just nice to get that extra perspective. Very cool.
Yeah. Lizards. Almost lizards.
Yes. Nearly lizards. Now, I want to talk about nearly crocs. This is research on crocodilomorph ecology, how they're surviving, and how that relates to them making it through to mass extinctions.
All right.
This is research by Keegan Melstrom et al. In Paleontology, and the article is a press release by the University of Utah in Science Daily. So crocodilomorphs, we've talked about them every now and then. I mention them from time to time. They are the sole surviving lineage of the pseudosuchians, which is the broader cousins of crocodilomorphs. They are famous for having a very long lineage, like going back to the origin is over 200 million years of time that they've been on the planet. And during that time, they survived the in-Triassic and in-Cretaceous mass extinctions. And though this has been a famed aspect of the lineage, how they survived it has not actually been researched directly.
Yeah.
Of what traits seem to have helped them make it through those extinctions.
Yeah, not only did they survive both of those extinctions, they did pretty okay.
Yes.
In the wake of as extinctions go.
Yes.
They did pretty okay.
Historically, studies like this looking at like extinction survival rates have often focused more on mammals and the traits that we see in mammals during extinctions. And in them, we see the famous trend that generalists, those that are not piggy eaters and not living specific lifestyles, tend to do better and tend to even thrive after a mass extinction. And while this has been suggested for crocodilomorphs, it's not actually been studied to figure out if that is the trend we see with them. So that's what this research attempted to do. They wanted to test how their dietary ecology and their habitat usage seemed to affect who survived and who didn't. What patterns we see with the survivors and those that didn't make it through the mass extinction in what they were eating and where they were living in the environment. They used morphometrics, so similar to what we were just talking about with that lepidosaur, of teeth and skulls of 99 extinct crocodilomorphs and 20 of the living species to create a fossil data set spanning that 230 million years of history for the group, so that we can have a nice range of sizes and shapes. And throughout their history, they then used a previously built database of non-crocodilian animals, same kinds of measurement, so 89 mammals and 47 lizards, to be able to compare the kinds of morphologies and diets and see which of the fossil ones fell closer to some other non-crocodilomorph groups. They found that many of the extinct crocodilomorphs have morphologies, shapes, and likely diets that do overlap with modern crocodilians, but also many modern lepidosaurs, many modern lizards, supporting the diverse range of diets that we already knew that many fossil members had. Today's members are mostly generalists, and in the fossil record we have everything from carnivorous, hypercarnivores to herbivorous members. And though there was a lot of overlap with those two reptile groups, there wasn't a lot of convergence with mammals.
Okay.
So there doesn't seem to be, at least in the way that they're being generalists or specialists, they're not doing it the same way as mammals. And there were a bunch that fell into shape categories that aren't occupied by any modern amniotes, at least. So some that were doing something that we don't really have a good example of today. The pattern they found over their evolution is that in the Triassic, the Pseudotsuchians were the dominant group, and crocodilomorphs were actually not as dominant, a bit more rare, smaller to medium-sized. We knew this. They seemed to mostly be carnivores at that time. And then as they go through the end-Cretaceous extinction, none of the other Pseudotsuchians other than crocodilomorphs make it. So only the crocodilomorphs make it through that one. And the hypercarnivore crocodilomorphs appear to have also died off during that extinction.
Okay.
So some of the specialized members there did not make it. But terrestrial generalists, so on land and wider diet, made it through, and then they diversified into a bunch of the crazy groups that are so famous throughout the rest of the Mesozoic, of the terrestrial predators and herbivores and marine groups. And then as we get toward the end Cretaceous, we actually see that crocodilomorphs start to decline. And a lot of these specialized lineages start to disappear before we even get to the end Cretaceous extinction, even many of the terrestrial generalists. So by the end Cretaceous mass extinction, most of the survivors were already the semi-aquatic generalists, and they were the ones that made it through, as well as some of the aquatic, marine carnivorous groups, which does support that also generalist diet was a winning strategy for them. It's also probably why they were able to make it through those two extinctions, that they are, even while being different body shapes, really good at being generalists. Like even today, who are all ambush predator body types, are all still very generalist in their diet. They can take a wide variety of prey animals, even a wide variety of food types, some of them taking fruit and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's likely that similar kinds of flexibility in diet were what led to their ancestors to be successful through some of the toughest times in Earth's history.
Yeah, makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That is sort of the we expect that generalists will do well. It is interesting that it was different types of generalists in each of those extinctions.
Yes.
That it was the more terrestrial groups, the first one, and then the more aquatic groups in the second extinction, which then leads to, that's the kind of crocodilians that we still have today.
Yeah, like, we got some more terrestrial ones after the Cretaceous, but they were never the norm after the Cretaceous. From there on out, our alligator and crocodile-shaped crocodilians were the standard after the Cretaceous.
Yeah. Well, and it drives home, like you said, that what allowed them to survive wasn't the exact same thing that allowed mammals that survived to survive, or birds to survive. Very cool. We're slowly putting together a manual on how to survive a mass extinction.
Right.
Everybody's different approaches to it. Well, speaking of mammals, my news that I have for my second news is about rhinos moving into the Cenozoic, and this in particular is about how a bunch of rhinos died.
Oh.
Notably, well, kind of it's about how a bunch of rhinos all ended up dying in the same place. This is research at Ashfall fossil beds.
Oh, that makes sense.
Which we have mentioned, but I mean, yeah, if you're going to study where a bunch of rhinos died in the same place, Ashfall is the place to do it. This is research by Clark Ward et al. In Scientific Reports, and we will link to another press release, lots of press releases this time, in Sci News. Ashfall Fossil Beds is a very famous fossil locality in Nebraska, here in the United States, dating to around 12 million years ago, about the middle of the Miocene epoch. Ashfall was a watering hole, so lots of animals were gathering around it. But what's especially famous about it, as the name implies, is that the fossils that are there are buried within ash. These layers of this downpour of ash that actually came from an ancient Yellowstone eruption.
Oh, yeah.
The Yellowstone hotspot has moved across the North American continent over the last several million years, or more accurately, the continent has moved across the Yellowstone hotspot.
Going hot, 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 hot.
So yes, trying to move fast. So it wasn't in Yellowstone at that time, but that hotspot has given rise to a number of subsequent enormous volcanic eruptions. One of them, around 12 million years ago, dumped a whole lot of ash on Ashfall fossil beds, well, what is now Ashfall fossil beds, in Nebraska, burying hundreds of animals in this fine ash that has preserved them exceptionally well. We've talked about Ashfall before. It probably came up in episode 131 at the very least. One of the most abundant species that is found at Ashfall is Teleoceras major, which is a species of barrel-bodied rhinos. These were a group of rhinos that were very widespread and common across North America up until about 4.5 million years ago. More than 100 of them are buried at Ashfall.
Crazy.
Well, more than 100 of them have been found at Ashfall, I should say. This has led researchers to investigate why they are found at this site in such abundance. One suggestion is that this species might have just been herding, or gregarious in some way, that they just moved and lived in big groups. It could also be that they all gathered at the same place for some reason. It has been suggested that they might have all gathered at the same place to get away from the catastrophe that was happening.
Yes, that's what I just thought, is they might have been gathering someplace they thought would shelter them.
Yes, exactly. We'll see that in like droughts and other disasters today. Animals will end up gathering in what appear to be safer places.
Yeah, or like storms and stuff you'll watch where there's a bunch of animals under a tree or something.
In this study, they measured isotopes from the enamel of the teeth to investigate the lifetime movements among the rhinos. Isotopes can reflect different, so they look specifically at carbon, oxygen, and strontium. Carbon isotopes in the teeth reflect the plants that the animals were eating. Oxygen isotopes are typically mostly influenced by water sources. And strontium also comes in through their food, but strontium is determined by the local geology. So if an animal has moved around over the course of its life, those isotope ratios will change over the course of its tooth development. Those movements could be seasonal migrations. They could be if they lived in one place when they were young and then moved someplace new as adults, which a lot of animals today do. Or it could be that they were trying to escape stuff, that
Yes.
they lived in one place and moved elsewhere. What they did here is they got isotope measurements from the second and third upper molars of 13 adult individual rhinos. The reason they did the second and third molars is because they erupt at different times in the life.
Oh, nice.
So the second molar gives you isotopes from earlier in the rhino's life, from when they were young, and the third molar gives you their adult, right? That erupts. That's like our wisdom teeth. It
Yes.
erupts as we reach adulthood. So this allowed them to compare young chemical signature to older. Now, there's a whole lot of discussion in this paper about the exact specifics of how the isotopes were different, but overall, they found that the isotope signatures were very consistent across the rhinos and from the second molar to the third, indicating no major shift in either their diet or where they were living.
Yes.
Which suggests that they probably spent most of their lives in basically the same place, in the region around what is now Ashfall. This is kind of surprising because modern rhinos tend to move.
Yes.
Right? There is a lot of motion in a lot of our large herbivores today, both where rhinos live, but also here in North America. Lots of big herbivores will move around over time. So the researchers then go over some hypotheses of what was it that might have allowed these rhinos to get away with not moving. It could be that this environment just had plenty of food.
Yes.
That just the climate at the time, the conditions at the time meant that there was food available all year round. They didn't have to migrate. They were not in danger of outcompeting each other or being outcompeted by other animals. They point out that if these rhinos were flexible with their diet, they might have been able to adjust their diet within the local plants instead of having to leave. They also point out that there is some evidence this has gone back and forth over time, but there is some evidence to suggest that Teleoceras rhinos were semi-aquatic, or at least spent a lot of time in the water or foraging in wet areas. And if that's true, they might not have been able to move very far.
Yes.
They might not have been open to migration because they had to stay where the water was. So it's possible that they had adaptations that allowed them to stay in one place. It's also possible that their lifestyle required them to develop adaptations that allowed them to stay in one place because otherwise they couldn't live the lifestyle that they were doing. Whatever the reasons are, these isotopes seem to indicate that these rhinos basically lived their whole lives in this one place, which partially gets at the answer to the question of why there were so many there, that they were not coming in from other locations. They did not all travel here and gather from elsewhere. They all lived there. Probably in an environment that was just able to support a very large number of these rhinos.
Which is also, like, there are also examples of sizable herbivores that basically hang out where, I don't think white-tailed deer migrate particularly. They tend to hang out where they are.
Yeah. I don't think hippos move all that much.
Yeah, I know that there are some examples where they will, like during the flood, they'll move into new areas and stuff. But I don't know if that's all hippos or the hippos who are near the floodplains.
Yeah, I don't think hippos don't come to mind when I think about migrating large animals.
Yeah, so not unreasonable, but it is very interesting and tells a different story of this wasn't a place where they were fleeing to, and they weren't caught in this eruption happenstance wise.
Right. They lived here.
They were going to get hit by this regardless, because this is where they were going to be no matter what time of the year it was.
And to be fair, the eruption happened over in Wyoming or Idaho or whatever. They were in Nebraska. They were getting hit by this ash no matter where on the continent they were.
Yes, very true.
This was a very big eruption. But yes, this does not seem to have been a safe haven or anything that they tried to get to. This was just where they lived.
Yes. Very cool. Neat. Homebody rhinos. I'm all for it. Well, speaking of large and weaponized herbivores, my next news is about ankylosaur trackway.
Teleoceras generally didn't have horns, but they did have tusks.
Yes, it's neat.
Like
indeed.
hippos.
This is research about footprints from an ankylosaur, and it seems potentially our first footprints from an ankylosaurid ankylosaur. And so very exciting in that regard. This is research by Victoria Arbour et al. In the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, and the article is by Margarita Bassi in Gizmodo. So the reason this trackway is so interesting is because of the number of toes it shows. It shows footprints for 3-toed feet.
Okay.
And dates to about 100 million years old, and is found in British Columbia and northern Alberta area up in Canada. It was different enough to be a new ichnospecies, so once again, things like trackways get their own species designation separate from whatever animal made them, because we can never truly match the footprint to who made it. The ichnospecies for this one is Rhalpatosaurus clava, and it has features of being an ankylosaur footprint, but it is different from the common ankylosaur footprints that were already known from North America during this time, which is Tetrapodosaurus borealis, which has 4 toes. And that's the big distinction, because there are 2 branches of the ankylosaurs, the nodosaurs, which didn't have a tail club and typically had 4 toes, and the ankylosaurids, which had the tail clubs and typically had 3 toes. And so our more common footprints are some kind of nodosaur.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first ankylosaurid footprints that have been discovered yet to date.
Very cool. That's very cool, because so many of the really exciting armored dinosaur discoveries in North America of the last several years have been nodosaurs.
Yeah.
So it's fun to get some ankylosaur representation in the news.
Absolutely. I think in the article, just in case anyone reads it, they say that this is a new species of ankylosaur, and it's not actually, the new species is the footprint identification.
Sure.
We can't identify the dinosaur.
Right. A new species of ankylosaur footprint.
Yes. But even though we don't know what kind of ankylosaurid made these footprints, they can tell some things about them. Once again, probably had a tail club because of the group it's in,
Mm-hmm.
and would have been roughly about 5 to 6 meters long, so 16 to 19 feet long, based on the trackway. It's also really exciting for a couple of reasons from the perspective of ankylosaur fossil record in general. One, it helps fill in a fossil gap for the group in this area of the world. These footprints date somewhere between 100 and 93 million years old, and there is a gap in North America's fossil record for ankylosaurs from the Middle Cretaceous period. So this helps fill in that gap a little bit. Once again, we don't know who it was, but yes, indeed, there were ankylosaurs here during that gap.
Yeah, they didn't just leave for some reason during that time period.
We weren't missing them, which had been suggested that we might have lost them for a time in North America before they came back. These footprints give the evidence that, nope, there were at least some hanging around. Who that footprint maker is, we don't know yet, but there was someone here. It's also exciting because it's found in some of the same localities that the nodosaur trackways have been found in, which indicates that both nodosaur and ankylosaurid dinosaurs were sharing these regions and coexisting together. So it's also just another glimpse into the ecosystem at the time and what kind of armored dinosaurs that we had, both branches of the ankylosaurs there.
Yeah, which also suggests that they were able to live alongside each other.
Yes.
That they weren't out competing each other, but that they were doing something different enough that they could be in the same region.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Makes you wonder if they ever got into fights.
Yeah. Because I know a lot of nodosaurs had like those shoulder spikes.
Yeah.
Like, would they be awkward to fight each other? Like, did they have very different...
They're just not able, like the shoulder spikes.
Yeah.
They're orientating themselves the wrong way.
Yeah, they go to fight. You want to fight, and they both are face to face, and they're like, what are you doing?
Yeah, this isn't how we do it.
Why are you facing me? It's like, what are you doing
and
over
then
here?
They just awkwardly walk away from each other.
Yep.
Which is how often it happens when different species try to fight each other. It's like, nope, I was wrong.
Yeah.
No, never mind. I'm not winning any mates from you. And we go back to eating grass.
You're playing the game wrong. I'm going home.
I said going back to eating grass, and someone's gonna really get on me for that anachronism there. It's fine. Go listen to the last episode, episode 215, to find out what the ankylosaurs were eating.
Yes, absolutely. And with that, we will wrap up the news and move into our first section of the podcast, where we'll talk about what's plankton and how do we tell it apart from other kinds of plankton. So, as is so often the issue we face when starting a topic like this, that is a extremely ubiquitous aspect of our planet, the concept of plankton is something that most of us who have had any biology class have come across.
Yeah.
This is the base of the food chain starting in the ocean.
Yeah, plankton is kind of like vegetation.
Yes.
It refers to a type of thing in an ecosystem.
The term plankton comes from the Greek word that means to wander or drift, which is an extremely apt word to use because that is what distinguishes plankton. These are organisms that can't fight the currents. They move with the oceanic currents. They can't swim against them, like a dolphin can migrate up current or down current.
Right. And even we, if you're in a lake that has currents or even in the ocean, you can swim against a current as long as it's not terribly strong.
Exactly. Like we would probably tire out before we got out of the stronger ones.
Yes.
But we can move ourselves in the opposite direction of a current.
Yes.
Plankton cannot. The definition of plankton are things that drift with the currents. They still may be able to swim. Many forms of plankton migrate up and down the water column. We talked about this during migration and during deep sea.
Yep. Episode 128 and 187.
Yes, that there are plankton that move up and down the depth of the water during night and day shifts. So they can swim. They're actually quite good swimmers.
Yes.
But not powerful enough to swim against a current. So they can move, like if you put them in a still pool, they'd be able to move around the pool fine. But if you're flowing the water, they can't move against that flow. They can move around in the water as it moves.
And that does mean that in the ocean, they basically can't go where they want.
Yes.
Because the ocean is not still.
Yeah, it is constantly moving. So they are at the whims of the global currents, moving across oceans and from continent to continent and coast to coast.
They are planktonic.
Yes, they are planktonic. That is the term used for creatures that live this way or other organisms that live this way. This is in comparison to the typical term you'll come across as nectonic, which is the swimming organisms.
Yes, we use the term pelagic a lot, which means open ocean, usually swimming around.
Absolutely. So these are fish, dolphins, whales, sea turtles that are still moving around the oceans but can move wherever they choose to.
Yes, and then that is as opposed to benthic, which means living on the sea floor. Crawling around on the floor like a lobster.
All of these terms are going to be important throughout this episode, so I hope you're taking notes. Also, some fun terminology. The study of plankton is planktonology.
Sure, great.
And a single planktonic organism is a plankter.
A plankter?
A plankter!
Huh.
And evidently, the more grammatically correct term than planktonic is planktic.
Yes, I've heard that.
Yes.
Actually, I think that came up with one of our guests at one point.
Oh yeah,
who expressed very strong feelings about planktic versus planktonic. I don't remember which. I think they were a big proponent of planktic.
Yes, and from the way it sounded, that is the more correct term, and there are researchers that use it more specifically. All the research I pulled used planktonic, so that is by far the more widely used term, and so sorry to our previous guest, that is probably what I'm going to end up saying.
Write in, send us an email.
I like that it has the word tonic in it. That's more fun.
I do think planktonic is a more fun word.
It's a more fun word to say.
More fun word. Also, it goes nicely with nectonic.
Yes.
Which also has it. So, yeah. write your angry emails, address them to Will.
Yes. You can put it in the Discord for our most recent episode.
We'll start a fight in the Discord.
So, plankton includes a wide variety of organisms. It is not a single group. It is not a single evolutionary lineage. It is any type of organism, living thing, that is free floating through the oceans. So it includes basically any kind of organism you could think of, which means that the organization for plankton is not so much based on what kind of animal or plant or whatever you are, but what kind of planktonic organism you are.
Yeah, how you are planktoning.
Yes.
More so than who you're related to.
The first two categories have to do with how long you're a plankton. Holoplankton live their whole lives as plankton. Mm-hmm. They are permanent residents. They will never move out of this lifestyle. Meroplankton have a portion of their lives as plankton. So usually, most often, this means larval stages of other sea animals.
Yes, this is really common, and we've alluded to this in past discussions. A lot of even larger sea life starts as tiny little larvae that just float around.
Yeah. Most fish, a ton of your crustaceans, a bunch of your benthic bottom-dwelling things like sea stars and anemones and things like coral start their life as teeny tiny floating larvae and then eventually either settle down or start gaining the ability to swim and become nectonic.
Yeah, kind of like if you imagine if frogs were marine.
Yes.
Tadpoles would just float around unable to do anything, and then they would eventually become frogs and actually be swimming around.
Yes. The other, and by far most famous categorization for plankton is what role in the food chain they fill. And so the two big groups are the phytoplankton and the zooplankton.
Right. The sun and food.
Yes.
Eating things.
Yes, exactly. The ones that eat sun and the ones that eat each other.
Yes.
Phytoplankton are the photosynthetic plankton. So algae is absolutely a huge component of this. But you also get prokaryotic. So the eukaryotes are like the algae, the actually close to being plants type things. And then more single-celled and quote-unquote simpler-celled organisms.
Bacteria,
yes.
Cyanobacteria are a major part of that.
Absolutely. Phytoplankton are typically on the smaller side. You will get colonial ones, but they're typically not getting very large. Some notable members of this are things like diatoms, which are microalgae. They are some of the most numerous of the phytoplankton. Approximately 40% of all phytoplankton is estimated to be diatoms.
Yeah, diatoms are little creatures that build, I believe they're silica.
Yes, they are.
Shells around themselves, which
yes.
is a very famous thing about them.
Called the frustial. That's what that little cell armor is called.
Yeah, armor is I was going to say it's a little cell in a box.
Yes.
Armor is a great description.
We'll talk more about those later, because they are big-time fossils. Well, teeny tiny fossils, but really important.
Yes. Well, they're also an enormous component of rocks.
Yes, they are.
That's what some rocks are made of.
Yep. Dinoflagellates are another form of phytoplankton. These also are found in lots of other environments. There's also benthic and symbiotic and parasitic versions of these, so they're not just plankton, but majority of the ones that photosynthesize live as plankton.
It's hard to photosynthesize if you're inside another organism.
Yeah, no, the sun doesn't penetrate as well. But less than half of dinoflagellates are photosynthetic. So this is one of those where it's a huge portion of the phytoplankton, but not necessarily a huge portion of this group are plankton.
Right.
As their name suggests, they typically have flagella, little swimmy hairs that they use to move around. And they also have cellulose plates that form a theca, an armored shell that also is very useful in our fossil record. Then you have things like cyanobacteria, another major component. These are often called blue-green algae, even though they aren't technically algae.
Right.
But they grow very similar to what you think of as algae. And then there are various other forms of planktonic algae. So tons of groups here, but those are some of the big players that will come up most often when discussing phytoplankton. One interesting note is that even though they are a big portion of plankton, and they are hugely important, as we'll discuss later, in the ecology of the ocean as being the plants of the ocean, basically, their species diversity is actually surprisingly low based off of at least some reports. It sounds like more recent ones might be upping the numbers, but their numbers are often seem to be like less than 5,000 species.
Interesting.
Compared to like the 300,000 species of land plant.
Right.
So like for doing a similar job, they seem to be somewhat low in diversity. So it's just
a smaller number of species that are just really good at it.
Yeah,
I guess.
It's a very interesting dynamic, and it doesn't seem like we understand exactly why that might be. There are definitely some that we probably are underestimating, like cyanobacteria and stuff, that we just don't have an actual good estimate on how many kinds there are. But for some, they are fairly species low for being a global group like this. And then feeding on these phytoplankton are zooplankton. These are the animals. These is where we're getting into animals and some like bacteria and amoeba and stuff. But still, mostly this is where we start getting into our animal groups. These are going to include all sorts of different things, from the larvae that we talked about earlier, technically fall under zooplankton, even if they are just starting as eggs, but they will eventually hatch into zooplankton.
You will eventually eat other things.
Yes, indeed. You have itty-bitty ones, like little protists and bacterial kind of organisms that are feeding on other stuff. But you also get a lot of small organisms, small animals that are floating around. Polychaete worms and floating gastropods, snail-type animals, and things like that.
Lots of crustaceans.
Lots of little crustaceans that are specialized at this. There is kind of two categories that they often get broken up to, and it's the non-gelatinous group and the gelatinous zooplankton.
Sure.
And the gelatinous zooplankton are jellyfish.
Yeah, I was going to say jellyfish and not jellyfish.
Exactly. There are other non-jellyfish gelatinous zooplankton.
Yes.
You know, comb jellies, salps, medusae, and things like that all fall into this group. But as one thing put it, all jellyfish are gelatinous plankton. Not all gelatinous zooplankton are jellyfish.
Right. This is an interesting thing about jellyfish, because when we think of plankton, we typically think of things that are very small.
Yes.
Well, because most of what you've listed so far are single-celled organisms.
Yep.
And then fish larvae are like so tiny.
Yes.
So we think of itty-bitty tiny things. But jellyfish, generally speaking, don't swim very well. They are really like plastic bags floating around in the current.
Yes. Like that pumping movement can allow them to swim. They absolutely can move toward and away certain things. And in different habitats, they can swim quite well if it's still water. But out in the ocean currents, that slow undulating, that slow pumping motion is not enough to go against the current. So that motion is actually mostly used for feeding. It also brings food into the tentacles and mouth.
Yeah, all those other plankton.
Yes. And jellyfish are also interesting because they can range from very small to huge.
Yeah.
So there's some plankton that are actually gigantic, like the lion's mane jellyfish, which is bigger than your average human.
Yes. And it is an important point to distinguish from what I said before. There are lots of jellyfish that are itty-bitty, super tiny, barely see them. But a lot of the famous jellyfish are quite big, and they get enormous.
And like the ones you think of that form those giant swarms are like moon jellies and things like that.
Yes, like Finding Nemo. I think those are moon.
I think some of those also were sea nettle. I can't remember.
Okay.
I'd have to actually look it up. But like moon jellies are like saucer plate sized.
Yeah.
You know, so like fairly decent sized animal.
And yet, plankton.
Count as plankton.
Macroplankton.
Yes, and we'll get into that in just a little bit.
Cool.
Yep.
Is that a term?
That is a term.
All right, that makes sense.
Indeed.
I did not know that.
Yep. The rest of your zooplankton are non-gelatinous, just, you know, not jelly-like. So gelatinous just being that you are soft-bodied and typically transparent and mostly made out of water.
Yes. Like the cube.
Like the cube. In this, you are just normal-bodied animals,
Yes.
like us and crustaceans and fish. I say normal as a non-gelatinous creature.
Yes.
These are going to include a bunch of your larvae. They're going to include a bunch of your little crustaceans. The most common here are going to be copepods, which are little planktonic crustaceans that are incredibly successful. More successful than I realized. They are found in nearly every saltwater habitat and freshwater habitat, and are usually the dominant member of zooplankton wherever they are, and are possibly the most numerous animal on Earth, with maybe the largest animal biomass on Earth. They are competed with this by Arctic krill.
Huh.
And in some Arctic species make up 80% of the zooplankton mass.
Wow.
Just ridiculously numerous. This is what plankton from SpongeBob is based off of.
Yes. Yes. And these are little crustaceans, which crustaceans, we often think crustacean, we think shrimp and crabs and lobsters and stuff. Tons of crustaceans do an incredibly good, successful job being plankton.
Yeah. They are not the only ones, but they are by far the ones that are best at it, it so seems.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned krill, which is another, maybe the most famous plankton.
Yeah.
Certainly zooplankton.
Yes. Well, because they are the ones that come up when you talk about whales.
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
Now you're getting big enough that a whale can eat you, and so very important. Zooplankton will also be feeding on zooplankton, so
There's a whole ecosystem within the plankton.
Yeah. Your krill are going to be up a few levels, feeding on smaller zooplankton and phytoplankton.
Yeah. Well, because krill, if you don't know what a krill looks like, krill are like little shrimps.
Yes,
They look like
basically
little
shrimp.
They are quite large compared to a lot of other planktonic, really itty-bitty things.
Yeah, a lot of your plankton are effectively microscopic.
Mm-hmm.
Even if not necessarily, you could technically see them without a microscope.
Well, you could see them.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to see them.
Exactly. They are going to be difficult to notice without aid of a microscope. A bunch of these, even non-single-celled organisms, are incredibly small.
Yeah. Some of them start getting up into the gigantic millimeters range.
You will get some other categories that are used here sometimes. Ichthyoplankton are referring to the larvae and eggs of fish.
Sure.
You also get a group that's really interesting called pseudoplankton. These are organisms that travel on the currents but live on floating debris.
Right.
Or floating organisms.
Yeah.
So things like a piece of driftwood and barnacles that live on that driftwood are living a planktonic lifestyle.
Yeah.
But they themselves would just sink.
Yeah. Barnacles are technically sessile.
Yes.
Which means they attach to a substrate. But if they are attached to a floating thing, that makes them plankton.
Yep.
Fascinating.
So you also get bryozoan jellies and an anemone type, medusae type things that attach and then feed out of the water, suspension feed like they would have if they were on a rock. But the thing they're attached to is some plant material floating around the ocean.
Yeah.
So pseudoplankton, kind of plankton.
Pretending.
Yes.
Hello, fellow plankton.
Yes, you will also get mixoplankton, which are things that can eat and photosynthesize.
Okay.
And so there are organisms out there, typically these are going to be microbe type organisms, but there are organisms that either can photosynthesize themselves or usually have ingested something else that can photosynthesize.
Right. They're symbiotic with a photosynthesizer.
These two groups are often called the constitutive mixotrophs and the non-constitutive mixotrophs. They can do it themselves or they're using someone else's chloroplast to do it. Some of these switch between the two depending on the situation. So they'll eat when photosynthesizing is not good and photosynthesize when there's not a lot of food.
Right. When it gets dark, they become ravenous.
Absolutely. This is something that corals would be a mixotroph, but they're just not planktonic.
Yes.
But coral lives the same way. They photosynthesize during the day, feed at night. And then you do get some other groups. Mycoplankton are planktonic fungi.
Mm-hmm.
Bacterioplankton, bacterial plankton. It's right there in the name. And then viroplankton, viruses floating around.
Sure.
There's a ton of those.
That makes sense.
This also brings us nicely to that size groups are often used to break up. Now, these size groups are the ones I pulled from the wiki.
Sure.
different things might use slightly different parameters, but you get everything from megaplankton, which are above 20 centimeters.
Okay, so big.
So big.
Stuff that's a foot long.
Big jellies are mostly what you're going to have here. Some big cephalopods, like deep sea cephalopods that don't swim, like the vampire squid and things like that. Macroplankton are between 2 and 20 centimeters, so within a foot.
Sure. Maybe some of your bigger crustaceans or fish larvae, or like a eel larvae,
yes.
I would imagine, because they're just long.
Exactly. Mesoplankton is the step down from that. We're getting from 20 millimeters to 0.2 millimeters. And from here on, we just get smaller and like the units start getting crazy.
Nanoplankton.
Yep. Microplankton, we're at 200 to 20 micrometers. Then nanoplankton, 20 to 2 micrometers. Picoplankton.
I was gonna say that as a joke.
Yep. 2 micrometers to 0.2 micrometers, and then femtoplankton, which are basically just your viruses.
Right. Just molecules.
Less than 0.2 micrometers.
And then below that, you have your plankton.
Yes.
And that's a joke for physicists.
Yep. You get your microverse plankton.
Yes.
Where they have reduced the space between their atoms.
Quantoplankton.
Another way we categorize plankton is by where they are. Mm-hmm. They're different habitats. The most common is by far marine plankton.
Sure.
That's
out in the ocean.
Most of the water on our planet. That's going to be most of the places that things that live in water can be. So that makes sense. There are freshwater plankton. It's just not as talked about as much, but...
Right. Well, there's no whales
to eat
them, so they're not as famous.
The ecosystem can only get so intense in freshwater because our biggest lake is still very small compared to the ocean.
Yes.
But there's tons of filter-feeding organisms in lakes that feed off of this plankton, and it still is fueling a bunch of ecological cycles. You'll also get a category that I just love this name and what this refers to. Geoplankton. Which are plankton, not in rock, but in isolated pools in the land. So little microscopic organisms and floating organisms in usually temporary pools.
Yeah, like puddles, kind of. Probably a bit more than puddle.
But puddle would count.
Yeah.
These are going to include things like nematodes, water bears, copepods again, but also amphipods and seed shrimp, other crustaceans. Most of these organisms are also really good at going dormant.
Yeah.
So when
sense.
Things dry
when
up,
the water's not there.
There's a bunch of organisms, things like triops, which are your dinosaur shrimp that you can get packets of. Those would not technically be planktonic because they are very good swimmers, but they live the same way where their eggs stay dormant. And so when a puddle forms, this whole ecosystem can come back to life.
Yes.
Complete with plankton.
Yeah. What are sea monkeys?
Sea monkeys, I think, are copepods.
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, sounds like that's a good guess.
Yeah, I think they're copepods. They might be something similar to, is it seed shrimp or the triops? But yeah, because I thought they were triops for a long time because that's that's what I got one time, and it wasn't sea monkeys, but it was the dinosaur shrimp is what they were called.
Yeah. All right.
So I'm not sure. I'm probably
look this up ahead of time.
Things.
So listeners, if you know what sea monkeys are, let us know.
I'm sure different ones have been
that's
marketed that way
that's
before.
Probably true.
But the weirdest group is aeroplankton.
Yeah.
Things in the air.
Yeah, this is a thing. I learned about this a few years ago, and it was a real changing how you look at the world kind of moment.
Yep. The air is full of living things. Most very small, and many not permanent airborne residents.
Yes. So what goes up typically isn't going to stay there.
You can't float in air quite as well as you can in water. It's just not as dense. But a bunch of different organisms can be found in any square foot of air at any given time, typically. Some of these are things blown up into the air by wind from the ground or from waves. Mm-hmm. And then some are ones that are purpose sent into the air, scattered through the air that way. Most are microscopic microbes.
Yeah. Like bacteria, viruses. This is why you can catch certain diseases from people coughing and sneezing, because they are airborne pathogens.
I found two numbers that said for bacteria and fungi as well,
Sure.
fungal spores and stuff.
Yep. This is why if you leave a piece of bread out, doesn't matter where you left the bread out.
Yep.
Fungus is gonna grow there.
It has probably already touched it. Even like that's why sealing it can slow the process.
Yes.
Because it's slowing exposure and it's slowing access to air.
Yes.
But whatever's going to grow on your bread's already on the bread.
Now, I guess it is important to point out, bread is made with fungus.
Yes.
So oftentimes with food, the fungus is just built. It came with the food.
It was already there.
But if it didn't, it's not hard for fungus to find places to gain purchase.
Yes. One thing mentioned that 1,000 different species of bacteria can be easily identified from the air, and 40,000 varieties of fungi.
Yeah, when I was preparing the fungal episodes, I don't remember if I mentioned this in the episode, but I read a description that was talking about how, fungi are found in every habitat on Earth and also have been documented some tens of thousands of feet in the air.
Yes.
Like airplanes are hitting fungi.
Yes.
Way up. They're also almost certainly hitting bacteria. Because once you're at the whim of the air, as long as there's air, you can probably get up there.
Yep. And if you get hit by an updraft, you could be miles up into the sky.
Yep.
And then who knows how long it would take before you could come back down.
Yeah.
If you're stuck in like a slipstream, you could circle the globe many times.
You could be up there for years and years and years.
There's also a whole bunch of algae and like moss and liverwort spores that spend a portion of their life in the air. This is also why any wet surface eventually becomes slimy, because algae's just in the air and it's waiting for a nice area where it can start growing. So this is why no matter where you are, you will start getting plant stuff growing in your water if you're not careful. You will get some microorganisms that blow up into the air. They're usually much more temporary, but like baby spiders can move this way, and any little plankton organism that's in sea spray can get whipped up into the air and stay there for quite some time.
Yeah, if your sea's getting churned up by a storm and that kicks a bunch of algae, that algae is just going to be up there for a while.
Yes. And some research has shown that they can move miles inland. So you can get things from the ocean, from the air, quite a distance from the air, from the sea.
There is a real, I don't know the details, but weather phenomenon where like the dust from one side of the Atlantic Ocean falls on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. I don't remember which direction it goes, but like Africa and South America are swapping dust particles. Yes. And there's going to be organisms in there. Yeah. Like bacteria and algae and stuff are absolutely going to get carried around.
Which is just another way that things are so much more connected than you often realize.
Yeah. But someone could cough in the Sahara and someone in Argentina could get sick.
Yep.
That's probably an exaggeration. I don't know how long bacteria survive.
It's one of those, it might not make it, but you probably could get hit by it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if it's
like
dead.
Hit in the eye.
So talking about interconnectedness, plankton is so vastly important to the way our world works that it is really impossible to impart that without plankton, our planet would not be our planet.
Yeah.
It would not function. It would just be so fundamentally different and less lively than it is. As plants are the producers on land, they are the primary producers. They take the energy from the sun, turn it into biomass, and then that now can fuel other organisms, which can create our diverse habitats. Phytoplankton are the primary producers of the oceans.
Yeah, it is how the oceans get usable energy.
Yep. And they are insanely good at it. I found these percentages, and these might not be, these might have shifted. So if they are slightly inaccurate, if anyone knows, please update me. But they are a small percentage of Earth's photosynthetic biomass, so the photosynthesizers. I saw one say less than 1%, but I don't know exactly. But like compared to forests.
Right, they're competing with land plants.
Exactly. They are actually a very small portion of the mass of photosynthesizers on our planet, yet they, I saw this number multiple times, make up about 45% of annual primary production.
Wow.
on our planet.
And this is an important thing, as we've sort of discussed before. Plants, for the most part, don't live in the ocean.
No.
There are marine plants, but for the most part, plants are a land thing. So you don't get forests in the ocean or grasslands in the ocean. That's just not the domain of plants. So for almost half, potentially, of the photosynthetic activity that's going on the planet to be being done by these not plants.
Yep. And this is partially because even though they are only going to be functional in the shallow waters, because that's where sunlight hits.
Right.
You can't have deep sea phytoplankton because there's
You can, but not for very long.
They won't make it. So they're only covering the shallow portion, surface waters of our oceans, but our oceans are 71% of our planet. So even with that, they have so much more real estate to be productive in than land plants even have a hope to compete with.
Yeah.
So they have a lot going for them real estate wise. Estimates have ranged between 50 to 80% of oxygen on our planet.
Cool.
So at minimum, they're producing half the air that we breathe. At maximum, they are producing most of it.
All of it.
Yeah. They are extremely efficient. They are incredible. So save the rainforest for us, our breathing air is absolutely a good slogan.
Yes.
But algae is so much more important than people realize when it comes to our breathable air.
Well, and, episode 75, we talked about the Great Oxygenation Event, which was the first time that the Earth's atmosphere switched to being more oxygen rich. And it is inferred, that was a 5. We did that as an extinction episode.
Yep.
Because that was inferred to be a massive turnover. That was 1.5 billion years before plants.
Yep.
That was plankton.
That was these guys.
These cyanobacterial mats and stuff like that.
Absolutely. I saw one thing that suggested that part of why their biomass might be so low is just that they're grazed on so heavily, that they are eaten so consistently that their biomass can never propagate the same way that land plants can.
Yeah. Just that phytoplankton don't last very long.
Yes, exactly.
They've got a fly's lifespan.
Yep. As often goes hand in hand with photosynthesis, they are incredibly important for the carbon cycle. Not just phytoplankton, though, zooplankton as well, because as they grow and build their bodies out of carbon, which is what us Earth organisms are made out of, and they die, they sink down into the ocean, which is called fixing the carbon. It locks the carbon away.
Yes. Yeah, once as these things float, this is why when you hear about the carbon cycle, the ocean always comes up as such a big deal, because all of these organisms are taking in carbon from the air, from the water, and as they sink down, if they don't get eaten along the way, if they make it down into the sediment and get buried, they might never, unless something burrows down and grabs it, it's in the sediment now. And eventually that sediment will get buried enough and become rocks.
Yep.
That's where limestone comes from.
Yes.
That's what limestone is the buried remains of planktonic, especially photosynthetic organisms. And once it's limestone, it's rocks now.
Yeah,
that carbon is not going back into the atmosphere until it gets subducted and recycled as volcanic matter.
Yep.
That then that's where volcanic carbon comes from.
Yes.
That's why volcanoes produce carbon, because they are recycling it from the rocks that are melting out of the volcano.
Which is going to take millennia for that cycle to come back around. So it's really important, especially nowadays where we're pumping so much carbon into our atmosphere. I saw one statistic that said about 40% of all anthropogenic human-generated carbon dioxide has entered the ocean through means like this. So they're ridiculously important for maintaining the carbon balance of our planet.
Yeah, we call it a carbon sink. There are many carbon sinks, and life is one of them. We are a carbon sink.
Yes.
Because we take in carbon, and unless we get decomposed, that carbon stays within us. Plankton and other small organisms in the ocean are one of the most important carbon sinks on Earth.
Yeah, because when we get buried, it's 6 feet down. When they get buried, it's
limestone.
The abyss.
Yeah.
It's as far down as you can go.
Yes. The other way, I guess, that carbon gets returned if they don't become a volcano is they get uplifted.
Yes.
And then it can be exposed to various processes that can release some of that carbon back into the air.
Yes.
Like here where we live in Tennessee, we're surrounded by limestone.
Yes,
that
indeed.
500 million years ago was carbon material that was caught up in these rocks and is now exposed to the air again.
Now is its chance.
Now's its chance. And if it's getting weathered, some of that weathering is just drawing more carbon dioxide out of the air. So it goes both ways.
There are also other nutrient cycles that are really important. Diatoms are really important for cycling things like nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon and oxygen and silica. So like other nutrients in the ocean, just like we talked about fungi being very important for that with land plants. Plankton is doing that in the oceans, making different nutrients usable and fixing them in ways that then when they are eaten, enters the food chain. It's also, just while we're throwing out percentages, diatoms alone are estimated to be about 25% of that primary production on Earth.
Yeah.
So more than half of the primary production that goes to plankton, probably diatoms.
Diatoms are a big deal.
They really are.
Yeah, for a group of organisms that we maybe have never mentioned on the podcast before. I'm sure they've come up once or twice, but that's a big deal group.
Yeah. Due to all of this, they are not only important for the environment, they're also really good indicators of the environment. They respond really well to environmental changes. Well, they respond really dramatically.
Yes.
They respond in a way that is good for informing us.
Yes.
Part of this is that they don't live long. Mm-hmm. So when we take a sampling of them, the data's not confounded by last year's phytoplankton. We basically can get a snapshot of right now without having to worry about last season's or next season's coming up. They have very short, quick life cycles. They also change their distributions very quickly and rapidly. Like if temperatures change and a new area of the ocean becomes favorable for a type of plankton, their population explodes into that range very quickly.
Yes.
Or will recede when conditions aren't favorable. So where they are at the time is also really informative of what's going on and what the conditions are. And they're not commercially exploited.
Yeah.
We aren't over hunting plankton.
Yeah.
So they are still a fairly untouched, like they're being affected by things we do, but their population.
But we're not farming them.
Yes.
Yeah.
The changes in their population are going to be due to natural things more often, or
at least environmental
side effects
things
of us, not direct action by us.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Due to this, and due to some research that has been showing changes in plankton, they are a big area of study during our current climate crisis to see what we can expect and see what's happening. One of the things that can come from both changes we're making, but also just normal dramatic weather, is algal blooms.
Mm-hmm.
Plankton goes through blooms where conditions become favorable and their population explodes. And typically that just is going to cause things like a very nutritious time of year for things to feed on. Sometimes, though, it can have negative side effects for the surrounding environment. The most famous is algal blooms. Harmful algal blooms.
Right. Well, like red tide.
Yes.
Is an example.
Exactly.
Of one that has a bad reputation.
Mm-hmm. Which I found out during this research, red tide is just the general term, used to be the general term for marine harmful algal blooms.
Interesting.
Not a specific one. It was named because of dinoflagellates. But not all of them actually make red. Like,
sure.
There are different colors. And as they pointed out, which I found funny, it has nothing to do with the tides.
Sure.
The tide is just a catchy term.
The water. Yep. And red is for the blood.
Yes. So red tide is kind of a...
The harmful effects that they have are typically not bloody effects.
Nope. From what I read, the red tide as a term is a kind of outdated one now.
Sure.
It's not used anymore. Harmful algal bloom is the one used because it's a better catch-all.
Yes.
This will typically happen during warm times with warm waters and when nutrients is plentiful.
Yeah. Like sometimes you'll get a current change that sweeps a bunch of nutrients into one area and then the algae go nuts.
Yes.
Or whatever photosynthesizers they are.
Exactly. The reason this can be problemsome is because, one, that means they can outcompete other things.
Mm-hmm.
So they can use up nutrients that would have been used by other organisms in the water. Many of them produce toxins, which can be in that large of a population, start poisoning the water effectively and killing off other animals in the water and potentially being harmful to animals like us and other mammals and birds. If their populations get so dense that they start blocking out sunlight to things growing at the bottom of the water,
Yep.
they can kill off ecosystems that way. And they can create low oxygen environments, not due to themselves using oxygen, but due to the cycle that they kick off.
Yes. Well, and in particular, one of the big dangers that algal blooms form is that when they die, the process of decomposition draws in oxygen.
Exactly.
So it's actually the oxygen effect can be some, because you would think, you're like, well, they're photosynthesizers.
They're going to be making tons of oxygen.
Yeah, they're going to make lots of oxygen, which is true. The oxygen problem happens when they're done.
Yes.
When the nutrients go away or they've used them all up, and then you get a mass die-off of these photosynthesizers, and that pulls oxygen out of the water.
As bacteria breaks down their bodies, they use up oxygen, and they can use so much oxygen that they create what are called dead zones.
Yes. This has come up a lot in extinction discussions.
Yep.
Because when we see ocean anoxia, one of the things that can cause anoxic conditions in waters, coastal waters and such, is this exact kind of thing.
Yes. So you can get these environmental cascades that a algal bloom causes that just ends up really wrecking the local ecosystem for the time that the bloom lasts for.
Phytoplankton giveth, and phytoplankton taketh away.
I did see, I think one title I saw was The Perils of Plankton.
Sure.
And they were saying, they're super important, but sometimes.
Every now and then. Well, it's like the microbiomes in our bodies.
Yep.
It's like, that's vital. You need that to live. Every now and then, some of them are going to attack you.
Yep. These blooms can be all sorts of things. Two of the most common are going to be diatoms and dinoflagellates in the ocean, and cyanobacteria are going to be your blue-green algal blooms in rivers and lakes and stuff. Some of these are caused by what I saw called dual-stage life systems, where they live as benthic, in the mud microorganisms, and then have a planktonic life stage. And when all of those mud organisms...
Like cicadas?
Yeah, basically.
all emerging at once.
And that when they all come out, it can create a bloom and cause some of these cycles.
Yeah, well, like you were mentioning, a lot of planktonic organisms can be dormant or are larval. So they're released in the right conditions.
Yes.
So if you get the right conditions, it could trigger the release of all of these larvae or the revitalization of these dormant forms, and you just get them all coming out of the sediment and stuff.
And you can also get similar sinking up issues with, if there's a bunch of fish larvae that are eating zooplankton that would be eating the phytoplankton, a bloom can last way longer. So if it happens at a time when a spawning event for another group would provide predators for the phytoplankton's predators, you can get really bad blooms some years when a bunch of scenarios sync up and exacerbate the system.
Yeah, these sort of blooms are a really condensed and dramatic demonstration of what happens when an ecosystem balance gets thrown off.
Yes.
Because that's exactly what's happening, is that you have too much of one part of the food web, of the ecological system. It's the same thing that we're talking about when we talk about the long-term effects of if we remove the forest or if we get rid of the wolves. A bloom is that happening in a week.
Mm-hmm. And so it can just change the color of the water. It's something that even we can notice.
Yeah, well, that's why red tide is such an evocative, because, it changes the color of the water.
Yep. And speaking of, noticeable blooms, Jellyfish blooms are another version of planktonic bloom that has been happening, it seems, more commonly in recent years, potentially due to changes we're making to Earth's environment. Like other plankton, jellyfish breed really quickly. So when conditions are right, in, once again, warm climates with lots of nutrients, they can just explode their numbers. And they have similar side effects. They're not toxic the same way, so they're not poisoning the food chain the same way, but they are predators.
Yeah.
And they can eat an ecosystem basically down to nothing. They also can cause the same sort of oxygen dead zones when their bodies die and decompose. And they are good at handling low oxygen environments. So they can persist through that and continue to bloom.
It's a thing that often happens with the micro blooms, is that they end themselves, basically. Yes. Either they've used up all the nutrients, or they start to decompose and the oxygen goes away. That the bloom is its own demise.
Yep.
A group of organisms that can bloom and then survive in the harsh conditions the bloom causes is scary.
Yeah, because then they could move to a new area. They could last long enough to be carried into new areas and continue the effect.
Just like a shadow on the landscape.
Yeah, and like if you ever see a picture or a video of these jellyfish blooms, it's intense. It's like from the surface, it looks like it's more jellyfish than water. They're just shoulder to shoulder if they had them.
Sure.
Nothing but jellyfish. It's crazy. One interesting thing that I found that is likely to help cause these that I wouldn't have considered is coastal development by us humans. When we develop a coast, we put in a bunch of structures like piers and stuff, which gives hard surfaces for their polyp stages to settle. Because jellyfish have a Medusa anemone-like stage.
Right.
Their larva settles down, creates a little anemone-like structure, and then that pops off a bunch of baby jellyfish. And those then spend the rest of their life growing and swimming. So when we create more hard surface structures along coastlines, we give perfect real estate for them to completely cover these and just explode their populations.
It's an interesting, we've talked about this again with extinction episodes. What goes on land is often related to these blooms. Mm-hmm. One of the most common examples of this is when you get if a forest disappears.
Yes.
What happens is that the plants are no longer keeping the soil in place. So you get all of this sediment washing into the ocean. And if it's nutrient-rich sediment, that can cause a bloom. So if you have a catastrophe on land, that can then cause a catastrophe in the water by that nutrient flux.
Absolutely. They're also really bad for nutrient cycling because just like plankton typically acting as a carbon sink, they are a higher up organism than most in that they are eating more. So they're taking in also a bunch of phosphorus and nitrogen and other things from the plankton they're eating. So when they die, they also lock away a bunch of good stuff.
Yes.
That other organisms would have been using. So they can also deplete a bunch of nutrition that way. So yeah, plankton's super important, but if it gets out of hand, it can get really toxic, literally.
Yeah.
And at this point, we'll take a little break and come back to talk about the fossil record of plankton.
Because if you thought plankton was important today,
yep,
it's not a surprise that it is very important in the past.
Extremely. So stay tuned. To discuss the fossil record of plankton, we kind of have to split things up because our phytoplankton and zooplankton are very different, literally, organisms to deal with. So we're going to talk about both of them and their histories and what fossils we find in two parts, and then we'll talk about how important plankton is to the fossil record. First, phytoplankton, because they came around first.
Sure. They were here first.
Yep. Phytoplankton fossils are incredibly well known, mostly through cell walls and scales and cysts, those hard shell and cell wall-like structures that many of them grow.
Yeah. Like with, we've talked about, crustaceans and especially things like clams and trilobites. that are building hard parts for their bodies, and they're building them out of minerals, right? A clamshell is calcium carbonate. They are building it out of mineral. Well, those diatoms, that armor is silica.
Yes.
You built it out of quartz. So when they die, those end up part of the fossil record very easily.
And we have tons of those. We also will study them through biomarkers, which are like the molecular signatures that life was happening and doing certain things in rock.
Yes.
That's often how we study ancient microbes.
Yeah, you'll find chemical traces in the rock that are the kinds of chemical side effects of organic activity.
They only make sense if life was there to make it happen. The microfossils, though, are often really hard to actually identify down to what kind of algae it was, what kind of plankton it was. Many of them fall into a group called acritarchs, which is what you'll hear referred to as a waste bin group, where this is the group for these things. They are definitely not all related to each other. This is definitely not a true taxonomic group.
Yeah, it's not so much a type of organism as it is a type of fossil.
Yes.
And these are real, like in the Paleozoic and the Archean, Precambrian, there are tons of fossils that are like, yep, that's an acritarch.
Yep.
Why? Because I don't know what it is.
Because often what we're finding are these shelly pieces of the cell, but that's not even necessarily going to show us what the cell was like.
Right.
It could just be a part of it. And so therefore we're not able to always tell what was making these things, but they're definitely the same kinds of structures that we see in many modern plankton.
Right.
Most acritarchs are thought to represent these cysts, these little shelly type structures, cell wall type things, and their interpretations of what kind of plankton they might have been are mostly made by comparing them to dinoflagellates, which make very similar structures and will include many of the fossils that we find. But that's definitely not going to be a always accurate comparison. But that's about as best we can do with a lot of these. Starting way back in the late Precambrian, it is likely that prokaryotes were your most common phytoplankton. So not algae yet. Things like cyanobacteria or other cyanobacteria type stuff. Many of these were probably doing different kinds of photosynthesis than the ones we're familiar with now. Some might have used things like hydrogen-2 as part of their step for doing photosynthesis. And so they might have been using different biochemistry because of how different things were back then. But these were probably our first floating around photosynthesizers, and they would have been the main group before the Cambrian. We have things like biomarkers that seem very similar to cyanobacteria in rocks going back to 2.7 billion years ago, suggesting that they had already evolved oxygen photosynthesis. And it wasn't probably until about 1.5 billion years ago that we started getting eukaryotic, so more algae-like photosynthesizers.
Yes, more plant or fungus-like things.
Yes. This would have been right before and into the Cambrian that we start seeing things like green algae becoming a main player as phytoplankton. And interesting, with acritarchs, even though we don't know who they all were, we still can see some patterns in their record. There's a major shift at the beginning of the Cambrian in the acritarch fossils. There seems to be a shift in the kinds of acritarch fossils we see and appearance and diversification of a group called acanthromorphs, which are very small size, that seems likely to indicate the switch over to a more modern style planktonic environment, and the one that we will see throughout much of the Phanerozoic.
Interesting. It makes sense to see that around the Cambrian, because
Yes.
that's when we see modern style ecosystems show up. That's when we have animals proper, and it's when we start to see carnivores and herbivores, in the sense that we think of today.
Yep. One of the big shifts here is that the ones that show up are very small and tiny in size, which is in comparison to large forms that were in the Ediacaran before the Cambrian, which likely is due to new predators.
I was going to say, things are eating them now.
Yep, and now being big and easy to eat is probably not good. You want to be smaller.
Yeah. This is a thing that is noted to happen in the Cambrian, that, like, bacterial mats become much rarer, probably because there were grazers now.
Yep.
Yeah, early snail-like things were eating them.
As we get into the Paleozoic, the acritarchs we find might largely belong to green algae.
Okay.
Based off of biomarker analysis and things like that, it seems like green algae is becoming a more predominant member of the plankton in our oceans. And so many of the ones we're finding, many of the acritarchs we're finding likely are representatives of that. And the forerunners of true algae date back to the Cambrian. We actually had some fossils from the Cambrian that seem to be showing similar colonial structures as modern algae. And the way that the colony is organized and the spininess of the algae also seems to indicate a potential response to predators.
Okay.
Also likely indicating that the plankton are reacting to this new rise in predator organisms.
Yeah, it's not so easy to be plankton anymore.
Yep. We also start to see things like dinoflagellates show up during this time in the Cambrian. And as we move through the Paleozoic, a bunch of organic walled acritarchs are very dominant and stay dominant up until the Permian. And then as we get into the Mesozoic, we see another big shift happen. This is when we see algae like diatoms, dinoflagellates, and haplotypes radiate and become major players.
Yeah, so more modern style planktonic organisms.
Yes.
Well, this is also around the time of the Mesozoic marine revolution.
Exactly.
Where we are, again, shifting ever closer to a more modern style ocean ecosystem.
Exactly. And likely that changing up of things would have affected things similarly to the Cambrian. I also thought one thing, note that it also would have been stirring up more nutrients from the sediment into the water and potentially fueling different kinds of groups. They also note that the big radiations we see in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic also correspond to massive sea level rises. So also the ocean was more ideal for plankton.
There's more ocean.
More ocean. It was also would have meant more diversity between the deeper parts of the ocean and the coastal. So it would have basically given more environments to help diversify and speciate plankton groups. And then it seems phytoplankton diversity continued to increase through the Cenozoic after we get out of the Mesozoic, even with sea levels beginning to fall, and primarily due to diatoms diversifying like crazy.
That are just taking over.
Yep. One big note we have to discuss when it comes to phytoplankton evolution is the evolution of their ability to photosynthesize and endosymbiosis.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about this with plants before, that there are single-celled microbes, bacteria, that can photosynthesize by themselves. But most other cell types and organisms that want to photosynthesize had to, at some point, eat one of those bacteria, and then instead of digesting it, either kept the bacteria or stole its chloroplast to then be able to photosynthesize for themselves. How this happened is not fully known, but it likely happened very early in the evolution of eukaryotes, which are the cells that have these kinds of organelles in them. And this event is sometimes called the primary endosymbiosis, the first event where it happened, and is often dated to be somewhere around 1.6 to 1.25 billion years ago. This then led to kind of like a spy versus spy sequence of other cells then engulfing those cells to then endosymbiose those initial cells that ate the bacteria. And this happened many times to then produce many of the lineages of algae.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have secondary endosymbionts that ate someone who ate the bacteria, and there's even tertiary versions that ate someone who ate someone who ate someone. So that's a brief overview of the evolution of phytoplankton. Now let's quickly go through zooplankton. Zooplankton, as we mentioned up front, are many different lineages of animals, so each of them would have their own evolutionary history, But we can talk about some historical trends, and because of how diverse zooplankton is, studying their fossil record can be very different. Mm-hmm. Their fossils are going to look very different depending on what kind of group you're looking at. One thing that is a challenge for identifying zooplankton in the fossil record is when to call an animal planktonic.
Yeah.
How do you tell that it was a planktonic and not just open ocean, pelagic?
Yes, not swimming.
Yes.
That's easy to see in modern because we can watch them.
Absolutely. Typically, there has been a bit of a bias in the paleontological definition of zooplankton because very often only animals with no perceivable ability to swim get grouped here. And then the other attributes that are considered is if they have a very wide distribution and are found in many deoxygenated sediments, so environments that would have been deep sea. Mm-hmm. But they point out that many plankton today are good swimmers, just not strong enough to swim against the current. Like we said, they swim up and down the water column. And wide distribution and presence in the deep sea is actually a definition of pelagic,
right? Not
necessarily just planktonic. So very commonly, fossil organisms that have no signs of being able to swim are considered planktonic. If they have swimming attributes, they often get described as pelagic. This clashes with the way it's described nowadays and with the reality of plankton nowadays in that most pelagic invertebrates are planktonic.
Yeah.
Basically, minus cephalopods.
Right.
Everything else, squids are great swimmers. Every other invertebrate that's out in the ocean is usually planktonic. And so it's been suggested that that's the definition we should use, is if it seems like it's a pelagic invertebrate, we should probably consider that it was planktonic.
Right. Because otherwise we might be underestimating the diversity of plankton in the past.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's hard to tell.
Exactly. You also get that confusion in that typically when we think about plankton, we think of small organisms, but many planktonic organisms can be quite large. Siphonophores can be over 10 meters long. And so there's a lot of biases that can make it hard to interpret or lean paleontologists away from interpreting an animal as planktonic.
Right.
Another one that's really difficult is pseudoplankton.
Yeah.
How do you tell if a barnacle was pseudoplanktonic or just being a barnacle?
I assume the answer to that is just don't worry about it.
Yep.
Just don't ask those questions.
There is some that that I saw mentioned. One is rarity.
Okay.
If they're rare, they interpret that things floating in the ocean is probably a pretty rare habitat. That's not going to be so common that you should be able to be super common in your environment. So rarity in
at least raises the possibility that they were living that lifestyle.
Exactly. If in this assemblage it's found very uncommonly, then maybe you were only floating through here every so often. Based on those fossils that have been described, this will be just really quick on the pseudoplankton, there does seem to be some interesting trends. The earliest fossils identified as pseudoplankton are from the Ordovician. Maybe not the earliest pseudoplankton, but the earliest we've identified. These are brachiopods and bryozoans. And we see high diversity of pseudoplanktonic creatures in the Ordovician and Devonian periods, and it's been attributed as likely due to orthocone nautiloids.
Oh, yeah, that makes
Shelled
sense.
cephalopods give a great place for these little clingerons to hang out.
Yeah, that's what they were riding before whales.
Yep. And then in the Devonian, driftwood would have been become much more common.
Yes, I was going to say, eventually you get wood.
Yes.
Although the Devonian also had a lot of fish.
Yes.
Some of which got quite large and could also have hosted hangers-on.
We also see diversity peaks happen in the Permian and Cretaceous, but no explanation is given as to what those would be syncing up with. So we don't know for sure. But the other two seem to have good explanations as to something showed up that's good for you to be on.
But those are just mysteries.
Yeah. Good time to be a hanger-on.
All right.
Another group that's going to show up in the fossil record and is one of those that we can assume was there more often than we're always going to be able to find fossils of is the planktonic larva.
Yes.
Like young of invertebrates and fish that are floating around as plankton. We have found fossils that seem to be larvae like this. Some have been found in the stomachs of fish.
Cool.
It's suggested that this is very likely the default for ocean life.
Yes.
That oceanic life, and animals specifically, started with planktonic juvenile stages.
Right. Well, like you mentioned, most fish today live that way, so it is a pretty decent hypothesis that most fossil fish were living this way.
Most fish live that way. I believe most crustaceans live that way. Your echinoderms live that way. Your jellyfish live that way. Like, most groups of ocean animals have, at least very commonly, planktonic juvenile stages.
Yeah.
Probably, at least very early in the evolution of animals, planktonic larva was happening.
Right. So yeah, there are probably, it is a safe bet that there has been planktonic larvae since the Cambrian.
Yes.
Just because there's been ocean animals that long.
Exactly. And that's exactly as I said. Like, we definitely know that it dates back to the Ordovician based off, like, solid fossil evidence.
Sure.
Probably goes back to the Cambrian.
Yeah. Well, if I remember correctly from the trilobites episode, way back when, episode 82, I think it's true that we don't get the youngest trilobites as fossils.
Yep.
Where you get all the different life stages, but the very earliest life stages we don't find as fossils, likely because they weren't hard-shelled yet.
Yes.
And I don't know if there is a hypothesis that those might have been planktonic larvae. There might be. I don't know off the top of my head. But, yeah, there were abundant ocean organisms that could certainly have been producing those sort of floating larvae.
Absolutely. And the fact that the larval stage is often softer bodied, as well as other zooplankton, like gelatinous zooplankton, makes their fossil record difficult because they don't fossilize well.
Yes.
And it makes total sense that this would go back to the Cambrian because it's a really great survival strategy. Because now, if you are especially a bottom-dwelling organism, if you want to spread your species, well, if you're a barnacle, you can't spread it anywhere.
You're stuck where you are.
So becoming planktonic as a baby means now you can spread across the ocean and populate many, many environments. They also note that it showing up in the Cambrian would also make sense due to increased predation. Get the babies out of here.
Yep.
Get them out into the water.
Anomalocaris is here. The eggs have to leave.
Go, flee, my children. Make a home somewhere else. As far as other groups of zooplankton, absolutely multiple evolutionary events.
Yeah.
This is not a single origin to floating animals. Many different groups have given rise to, and now we're talking about holoplankton, permanently planktonic lifestyle.
Like those copepods you were talking about.
Many, many different groups have given rise to this. There's at least 19 major groups of zooplankton that have come from benthic lifestyles. So that is a very common route, is going from living on the seafloor to living in the open ocean, floating in the water. And this can happen typically one of three ways. One, becoming pseudoplanktonic.
Sure.
You are a barnacle on a rock, and then you became specialized in being a barnacle on floating stuff. Pretty straightforward. You need to have had a planktonic larval stage for that one to work, because somehow you need to get to that floating stuff. Pediomorphism, or neoteny, meaning basically you just stay as a planktonic larva your whole life.
Yes.
If you already have a stage of your life where you are floating around as plankton, if you just never metamorphose out of that, or you keep the features that make you successful as that larva into your adult stage, you can just keep being a plankton your whole life.
Which is a trend that is very common that we see in animals today.
Absolutely.
Especially metamorphosing animals like salamanders and fish.
Yes. Well, when you have two distinct life stages, it's very easy to just turn off the switch that moves you from one to the other.
Yep.
And you just stay in that first stage and get old as a baby. And that's great if you want to float around. The third is migration of mature individuals, things that gain adaptations to be in open water. A great example of this are planktonic gastropods, snails that have specialized adaptations to their foot that basically acts like wings and can move them up into the water.
Mm-hmm.
So you can just evolve to float and move up into
and then not come back down.
And not come back down. In the Silurian, there are ostracods that seem to have adapted this similar way and just adapted to start floating around in the currents and living as plankton. As for the quick, brief history of zooplankton on Earth, once again, probably goes back to the Cambrian with most of our stuff, but in the Precambrian, most likely things like jellyfish were the dominant zooplankton that would have been floating around. There may have been other members. There was the whole weird assemblage of the Ediacaran biota, and some of them may have also had planktonic members and stages. But very likely our first major zooplankton were jellyfish or jellyfish cousins and like things.
Mm-hmm.
That will be hard for us to ever fully study since they fossilize so poorly.
Yep, they're real bad at it.
But based off their evolutionary record and the fossils we do have, it does seem to support that they would have been the first on the scene to really be filling this role. It's also been proposed that some acrotarchs could also be eggs and from other larval stages. So those also go back way before the Cambrian. And so some of those could have been zooplankton, but we don't know because that's kind of what being an acrotarch is. As expected in the Cambrian, we see diversity rise of zooplankton. Here, for similar reasons to phytoplankton, that predation is increasing. So these prey animals are going to have to respond, but also many of them are going to be new predators entering the ecosystem. And we see a mixture of Precambrian survivors, like some of those medusoid and jellyfish-like things, as well as new members coming from benthic environments. And then we also start seeing evidence for things like radiolarians and other single-celled animal-like zooplankton. One bit of evidence for this increase in plankton is that some fossil brachiopods, or brachiopod-like crustaceans from Cambrian rocks in Canada show filter feeding adaptations, and the size of their filters match plankton.
Cool.
So they are specialized for this new source of food that's becoming more common. And I did see one agnostid trilobites that have been suggested to have been planktonic. So there's at least the suggestion for some trilobites. As we move on, we start seeing some new players. The Ordovician was mentioned because we see a type of zooplankton called graptoloids, which are hemichordate, so they're close to our group of animals, but not quite, and are colonial. And this is another example where they evolved from benthic ancestors, but they became big-time players during this time and are often some of the most common zooplankton fossils that you'll see referenced. In the Devonian, we see a change in the composition, partially because of graptoloids going extinct, and with the appearance of ammonoids sinking up. So it's potential that we got new zooplankton predators.
Yeah, well, and especially the spiral-shelled ammonites. Those became extremely abundant and common.
Yep.
And I would imagine they were really good at eating stuff floating in the water.
A lot of cephalopods are really good at catching stuff floating in the water. They have special tentacles or tendrils that can catch these tiny things. And in fact, it seems like this time was a time of low plankton diversity. I didn't see exactly a suggestion of why, because it also seemed like it was affecting the phytoplankton, a low time of primary productivity. And the late Devonian extinctions really hit plankton hard. So we see a bunch of zooplankton diversity go down, and it was noted that it wasn't able to recover until the Jurassic. So plankton took a big hit during that time, and it seems like part of what made this so bad wasn't as much due to increased rates of extinction, but lowered rates of originations of new species. So just plankton was not diversifying very much. The extinction events that happened took a really long time for them to bounce back from. It's also been suggested that land plants, the rise of land plants after the Devonian, might have had effects to prolong this low diversity and this slow recovery, though exactly why it's not clear. It could be that the spread of land plants could have taken up nutrients like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus that would have been used by plankton. So they were competing. It's also that the root systems might have changed the nutrient influx into the oceans as weathering and erosion changed. But exactly how is not sure. But in the Mesozoic, we do see radiation of zooplankton again, specifically microzooplankton. And it's in the Middle Jurassic that we see foraminifera evolve, which is an incredibly important group. These are typically single-celled organisms, and they have those hard, shelly structures, tests, that we'll talk more about in just a moment. Their radiation seems to have come from them evolving from meroplanktonic ancestors, so where they were only temporarily planktonic and they became permanently. It also syncs up with high sea levels and warmer climates, which results in slower circulation of the ocean and increased the layers of ocean water, once again creating different environments for different species to become very specialized in. And when we see lower sea levels and cooler periods, those get more mixed and we see lower diversity. So the diversity syncs up with that very heavily. And then, at the end of Cretaceous, plankton gets hit really hard by that extinction. Phytoplankton especially, which caused mass starvation up the food chain, including zooplankton. And so we see a huge loss there, and the survivors are mostly small species.
Yeah, one of the first and most obvious signs of the end Cretaceous mass extinction that was noted by paleontologists and geologists wasn't the loss of things like dinosaurs and ammonites, but the change in forams.
Yep.
I've seen pictures of like drill cores that have taken samples of sediment and will zoom in on the fossils from each layer, and it's a diversity of big forams until you get to that boundary, and then it's rarer, tiny foraminifera. The plankton fundamentally changed.
And like foraminifera and radiolarians still are dominant in the Cenozoic, but they are much less diverse. And we don't start to see renewed diversity until the Miocene. And in fact, I saw one thing note that we still have not bounced back today from where we were before the end Cretaceous. It's also likely that after the Cretaceous is when we see a lot of our modern zooplankton groups, like a lot of our planktonic crustaceans and gastropods and things evolve. But most of those have a really bad fossil record, so we don't actually know. But based off of the phylogenetics and their evolutionary estimates, probably showed up after the Cretaceous. Just exactly when is not clear. So there are paleohistories, our quick overviews of what we know about how plankton has changed throughout the history of Earth. But plankton is also really important for telling us about the history of Earth, not just studying their evolution, but studying Earth itself and the environments these plankton have lived in. These are great indicator fossils, both from identifying ages, because different plankton lived at different time and they change over very quickly because they live and die fast, and of environments because they react to their environments, as we already mentioned. So we can get a lot of information from fossil plankton. This is true of many different kinds, but foraminifera, forams, are by far the most famous version of these indicator fossils.
Yeah, forams are among maybe the most famous microfossils.
Yes. The reason they're so good fossils to begin with is their tests, the hard shells they grow. These can be made out of many different things, silica famously, but also calcite and aragonite and other sediment particles. Some do lack tests, but many species do have them. These can be one or multi-chambered, so they can be different levels of complexity. Unlike most of your other shell-creating organisms, these tests are actually inside the cell membrane. So they're not a wall around the cell, they're a wall inside the cell. And so all the cell bits are inside the test. And then there are holes in the test that allow them to interact with the outside world.
Yeah, foram, you'll see images of them up close, and they've got these big old gaps in them, which is very distinctive.
Yep. Today, most forams are marine organisms. The majority are actually benthic, not planktonic, but at least 50 morphospecies is what I saw them called, are planktonic. Many have algal endosymbionts, so they can photosynthesize, but most are heterotrophic. They eat other things, thus why they come up in the zooplankton category. Further evolutionary history, the molecular clock estimates of their evolutionary rate estimates that they likely showed up between 900 and 650 million years ago, so somewhere before the Cambrian, which means their fossil record also spans basically all the fossil record of animal life on our planet.
Mm-hmm.
And studying these tests can give us tons of different information. Their tests are incredibly common. They also form geologic deposits. Chalk deposits, famously, are made out of foraminifera tests, as well as things called coccolithophores. One of the most famous uses for these tests is biostratigraphy, that we can use them to date rocks because specific forams lived at specific times, and we've mapped out their fossil records so thoroughly that if you get a piece of rock and it has foram fossils in it, someone who knows how to identify forams can tell you a pretty precise age for that rock.
Yeah, they are some of the fossil record's best index fossils.
Yes. This is because, as we mentioned, they tend not to stick around a single species for a really long time. So the assemblage of forams that lived during a specific time typically only lasted for a thin slice of time. So that gives us very accurate time estimates. Certain forams are also really good for telling climatic data based off of the isotopes of the minerals they're making their tests out of.
Yeah, this is a thing that forams are used extremely commonly for, is as they're building their tests, just like we've talked about with like teeth and bones are built of the materials that are being taken in from the environment. Forams are building their little shells out of the stuff in the environment, which varies based on temperature and based on other environmental conditions. So when we talk, a bunch of the times on the podcast, especially at mass extinction events, we talk about temperatures changing over time. A ton of that data is specifically ocean temperatures. Because it comes from forams.
Yes. We also can get like environmental information because a lot of forams only live in specific kinds of environments, you know, depths of water and temperatures of water and so on and so forth. So you also can get an indication of what kind of ocean that foram was living in, which can tell you what kind of environment these rocks would have been formed in. You also can get an information for sea depth at that locality based on the forams that are found and the combination of planktonic to benthic species.
Tells you how close you are to the seafloor.
Yes, so you can get a really good indication of a bunch of things about what was going on the planet at that time based off the forams.
Yeah, and the great thing with forams is that so much of our record of the ocean fossil deposits is just drilling into the seafloor and pulling up those cores. When we did our first Spotlight series, we talked to Adrienne Lamb about this because she did a lot of research on the specifically forams, found in deep sea core sediments. Because you can just drill down there and pull up millions of years of ocean floor record. And if you can identify the forams in that, you can tell the environmental changes and the climate changes over that time.
Yes, exactly. So they are critical for us mapping out aspects of the history of our planet, as well as helping us find where we are in the history of the planet. If some of this stuff sounds familiar, but not from a paleo perspective, this is also heavily used by drilling companies today to tell if they are in the correct layer of rock where oil might be found or other deposits might be found. So they will often have a micro-paleontologist on hand to help identify what rock are we drilling into. Is it even the correct kind of rock that we'd want to be in and the correct age? There are other plankton that can be used potentially this way. The coccolithophores, which are single-celled algae that also has their own shells, have been looked into. I found a paper talking about that they might also be really good carbon indicators. It might be another avenue for similar kinds of research and usage as an index fossil. So plankton can be really useful and has been historically critical to just not just like studying the ocean, but paleontology in general.
Yeah, and geology even more broadly.
Yes, exactly.
Plankton's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, it's a thing that is so fun. And we talked a lot in this episode about the parallels between plankton and plants. Because we talk about plankton very much the way we talk about plants on the surface, is that they're the foundation of ecosystems. And we also, in the fossil record, often use plants to tell us things about the environment and how environments changed over time. With plant fossils, we're commonly using things like pollen, where you can get a sediment sample and then just screen out bajillions of little bits of pollen that can tell you about the environment. Plankton works very much the same way, but in the ocean, where they're harder to get down to sediments that are still in the ocean, but a ton of the rock layers and the geologic history of Earth is marine sediments.
Yes.
And so anywhere you've got limestones and sandstones and shales and stuff, there's the potential to look for plankton and get information about those marine ecosystems.
Yeah, and
so just among the most crucial fossils that we have for learning about Earth history.
Absolutely. And once again, the reminder, 71% of our surface is ocean. So more rock and more history is being trapped there and created there than anywhere else. So it is really a crucial source of information, as well as being the foundation of the ocean ecosystem. So plankton's really important.
So put some respect on plankton.
Yeah. Go to the chum bucket and patronage plankton. Before we wrap up the episode, we have one section left, which is our patron question. Every episode, we like to answer one of the questions asked to us by our patrons, which at certain levels you have the ability to submit. So David, what's our question today?
We have a patron named Dave who says, the Dinobots, this is one of those nerdy questions.
This is for me.
This is for, well, the Dinobot. What are the Dinobots?
The Dinobots are the dinosaur-themed Autobots from the Transformers. In the original series, built because the Autobots went to a museum and went, whoa, those dinosaur skeletons look awesome. Let's make some robot dinosaurs that transform into robots to be on our team.
Which sounds to me like a much more logical explanation for the existence of Dinobots than whatever other explanations have come up.
There have been weird ones.
Yep. Dave says, the Dinobots traditionally consist of a T-Rex, Triceratops, Pterodactyl, sick, and a Stegosaurus. If Hasbro approached you, Will, today, and said you could create your own team of Dinobots, what's your lineup? Some caveats. You can keep all or none of the current members, no limits, but keep the team a reasonable size so we can stay within budget.
Yay. I picked this question because I already had an answer ready to go. Purely just because one day I questioned what would be the most scientifically accurate Dinobots that you could pick. The starting point is I'm keeping Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops.
Sure.
Because they're iconic.
So you're late Cretaceous.
Yep. Late Cretaceous, Western North America.
Yep.
Because that's where those two are found. And that is our limiting factor, and that's where the fun began. So Grimlock and Slag or Slug, depending on the name got changed because slag is a bad term in for British people.
In some places.
Yep. Can stay the same. They're good. We don't have Brontosaurus/Apatosaurus in this area or at this time.
Not in the late Cretaceous.
So we're not good there, but we do still have a giant sauropod during this time, Alamosaurus.
Mm-hmm.
This was a Titanosaurus, a really big sauropod, and lived in the exact same time. All of these reach the end Cretaceous. So
yes,
probably
so the latest Cretaceous, Western North America. Yep. As long as you're in that range, you are relatively feasible.
Yes. So Sludge is an Alamosaurus. I would propose a juvenile.
Sure.
Because otherwise he's like 4 times the size of the other Dinobots, and that's a bit too big. So a young or middle-aged Alamosaurus. I don't know how they aged. Because otherwise he's going to be over 80 feet long and 16 feet tall at the shoulder.
And that's OP.
That's too big. For Swoop, our pterodactyl or pteranodon Dinobot, there is one really notable pterosaur during this time at this area, and that's Quetzalcoatlus.
Yeah, we have Quetzalcoatlus from North America.
Yeah, and that would also be nice because then it would mean that Swoop is still a fair size compared to the others because it's one of the biggest flying animals that's ever lived. So he would be smaller but not tiny, which for accurate sizes for them all, any other pterosaur would make Swoop really small. And then finally, Snarl, who's usually a Stegosaurus, those are all gone.
Yeah, we don't have those in the late Cretaceous.
No, those are gone completely, but their cousins are still around, ankylosaurs. And famously, Ankylosaurus is in Western North America at the end Cretaceous.
Yep.
I suggest we switch out Snarl for Scar, who is a canon Dinobot from the IDW comics that was an Ankylosaurus. And he was a medic, so they need a medic. They need a healer.
You did it.
So that's them. If we have the budget,
check with Dave.
There are 2 more Dinobots that would fit into this place. Paddles the plesiosaur.
Sure.
Now, Elasmosaurus does not quite make it to this age, but Fresnosaurus, which is an elasmosaurid and roughly the same size.
We're noticing we've got Alamosaurus and Fresnosaurus. There's a trend here.
Yep. That, I think, would make a great Paddles.
Great.
And then, now this one, I don't know enough about Dakota Raptor as to whether, I know Dakota Raptor's a bit contentious as to how much of the material is actually Dakota Raptor.
Yes, there's questions about the identity of Dakota Raptor, but it is a large dromaeosaur from the Hell Creek Formation, which is where T-Rex and Triceratops and Ankylosaurus are from.
Yep, and Slash is the only female member, typily, of the Dinobots, and I think we need representation.
We have a girl one.
Yes.
Which is classic for Transformers-type media teams.
Yep. Those would be my Dinobots. I did a lot of research, not for this question, but because I'm a nerd.
To already have this ready to go.
There's a post on the Discord that I made where I made size relations of all of the dinosaurs and how roughly big that would make each Dinobot compared to each other. So you can see those pictures.
Go check it out on the Discord. I'll throw in a late Jurassic example, and it would we can have your Stegosaurus and your Brontosaurus, but then you have to replace with Allosaurus. Yes. You could put an Ichthyosaur in there.
Yeah.
And then I say, give us one of those late Jurassic pterosaurs or Archaeopteryx.
Ooh.
Now, Archaeopteryx was like the size of a crow, but I don't care. I think that's funny.
And I
think that's hilarious if one of them... I say keep them all to their size. Diplodocus, 100 feet long, and then a crow-sized Archaeopteryx. I think that's hilarious.
Yes, he's a microbot.
He goes on stealth missions.
Yes.
I know almost nothing about Transformers.
Well, then he makes them like Laserbeak, and I had an Archaeopteryx Transformer as a kid.
See, there, canon.
It was a really cool figure.
Sold.
All right, Hasbro, on my desk by Monday.
Hasbro, if you're listening. Reach out to us. Dave, thank you for that question and that excuse to let Will be Will for a couple minutes there.
I never thought this would make it onto the podcast.
This happened one of our end of the year Q&As. There was someone who was like, if you were a Pokemon gym leader, what type would your type be and what team would it be? And I was like, well, Will, while you think about it, I will give the answer that I already have to this question.
Yep.
Hey, if you want to be a patron, you could submit your questions and also get access to live streams and bonus content and all sorts of stuff like that. Link in the episode description. Our patrons get all sorts of goodies and they help us do the cool stuff we do here on the podcast.
Absolutely. Also down there, you will find a link to our blog post for this episode, which if you want more info or links to some of the info we used, pictures of Plankton, you can find it all there. If you're still itching for stuff to listen to, remember that we just wrapped up Silver Screen and the live stream is up on YouTube, so you can go watch and listen to those.
That's like 4 hours of content. And then if you're a patron, it's an extra 2.5-ish hours because we release more thoughts on Patreon.
Absolutely.
You can hear us gush about 2 of the movies.
Yep. Thank you to all the requesters for this topic and our most recent patrons who have joined us. Thank you especially to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Jeff Ellington, and Danielle the Bug Lover.
Thank you as always.
And with that, we release episodes every fortnight, and that's all I've got to say about... This is now another one of those things where someone will ask me a future question about Plankton, and I'll have to say, go listen to that episode.
You heard everything I had to say.
That's as much as I know about Plankton.
Insert some sort of SpongeBob quote. Here, I don't have any Plankton quotes that are appropriate for the end of the episode. This is my lab. That's my favorite Plankton line. Yep. I don't remember very much, but that's the one that I still have.
When he pulls out the golden spatula for SpongeBob, used to be one of them. Shing, sparkle, sparkle.
Oh yeah, there you go.
That was one. I used to say that all the time.
You did.
Yep.
I've heard you say it.
Yep. That used to be just one of my go-tos if any neat thing came up.
Listeners, get in the comments and let us know your favorite Plankton quote.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.